Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are examining one of the most polarizing choices in English literature, and that is Charlotte Lucas's decision to marry the pompous, obsequious Mr. Collins in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. We're looking at a specific disagreement that arises directly from the text itself. So the central question before us is this: is Charlotte Lucas's acceptance of Mr. Collins a necessary, highly rational triumph of pragmatic survival, or does it represent a tragic, degrading compromise of her intellectual and moral integrity?
Yeah, it's a question that gets right to the heart of how we evaluate agency in a world with incredibly restricted options.
Exactly. And we'll be exploring this tension through the characters' explicit philosophies on marriage, the merciless economic realities of the period depicted in the novel, and the critical framing provided by George Saintsbury in his preface to the book. I will be arguing that Charlotte's choice is a tragic capitulation that sacrifices her self-respect and intellectual life for mere worldly advantage.
And I will be arguing that Charlotte's decision is actually a brilliantly executed, clear-eyed strategy for securing the only honorable provision available to an unwealthy woman of her age and standing.
To begin, I think we really have to look at exactly what Charlotte Lucas is surrendering when she agrees to marry Mr. Collins. Because this isn't just a slight compromise on her ideal type. It is fundamentally intellectual and moral suicide. Charlotte is a sensible, highly intelligent woman of 27. She is fully aware of who and what Mr. Collins is.
Oh, she certainly has his number from day one.
She does, which makes the choice so devastating. George Saintsbury, in his preface to the text, captures the horror of Mr. Collins perfectly. He describes him as a masterpiece of Philistinism, possessing a well-meaning but hidebound morality and exhibiting a groveling respect for rank. When we talk about Philistinism here, Saintsbury means a total aggressive lack of intellectual or aesthetic sensitivity. This is a man completely devoid of genuine thought, independent judgment, or basic dignity. To willfully chain oneself to such a person is an act of profound self-degradation.
I come at it from a different way entirely. Judging Charlotte Lucas as having committed moral suicide ignores the fundamental, uncompromising material realities of the text. Charlotte operates as a supreme realist in a society defined by brutal economic constraints. We simply cannot evaluate her choices as if she possessed the same privileges or the same youthful, romantic luxury as Elizabeth Bennet.
But does that economic pressure excuse marrying a man who treats human beings as entirely interchangeable? Within the span of, a week? His matrimonial sights shift seamlessly from Jane Bennet to Elizabeth Bennet and finally to Charlotte Lucas. Women, to Mr. Collins, are just placeholders to satisfy Lady Catherine de Bourgh's command that he marry.
Well, it is a purely transactional approach on his end, absolutely. But let's look at Charlotte's end of the deal. She is 27 years old. In the socio-economic ecosystem of the novel, the ticking clock on her social expiration date is deafening. She is on the precipice of becoming a permanent financial burden to her family. She acknowledges that she is plain, and she explicitly lacks a large fortune. She is not a victim of circumstance. She is a master strategist playing a very weak hand brilliantly.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what exactly that survival entails day to day. We have to look at the character and the sheer absurdity of Mr. Collins to understand the depth of the degradation Charlotte has signed up for. Survival is one thing, but living with a man who the text explicitly says has a weak head and consequential feelings that damages one's own dignity irrevocably.
He is ineffably ridiculous, I will grant you that.
Ridiculous almost doesn't cover it. Consider his behavior. This is a man who refuses to accept Elizabeth's clear rejection, assuming she is merely being an elegant female who wishes to torment him. He actually thinks her saying no is a flirtatious strategy, and then there's the reading material. He reads Fortis's sermons aloud to the young ladies as a form of moral instruction.
Which is such a brilliant, excruciating detail from Austen.
Right? For anyone who hasn't dug into the historical footnotes, Fordyce's Sermons was basically a notoriously patronizing conduct manual. It told young women to be passive, submissive, and constantly agreeable. It's patriarchal nonsense, and Elizabeth despises it. And Collins reads it to them as a reprimand. He's utterly offended when Lydia interrupts his pompous delivery. And perhaps most tellingly, he delivers a 15-minute apology simply for suggesting that Mrs. Bennet might have had a hand in cooking the dinner.
Ah, yes, the potato apology. It's legendary.
It is a display of unbearable formal pettiness. By knowingly accepting him, Charlotte condemns herself to a lifetime of managing these absurdities, apologizing for his social blunders and listening to his sycophantic praises of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. There is a deep psychological toll to pretending to respect a man whom you privately know to be an absolute fool. The text shows us that Charlotte's intelligence will be entirely consumed by the exhausting labor of mitigating her husband's stupidity.
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered that Charlotte's intelligence actually thrives in how she manages his absurdity? You point out that Mr. Collins is a fool, and we are in complete agreement there. But Charlotte's triumph lies precisely in her clear-eyed navigation of his foolishness. She doesn't passively suffer his presence, she actively manipulates it.
Manipulates it how? By becoming his keeper?
By orchestrating her own rescue. Remember how the engagement actually comes about? She deliberately intercepts him in the lane to secure the proposal. She sees a market inefficiency. This foolish man needs a wife immediately to please his patroness, and she exploits it. She knows exactly what she is doing. Her intelligence is not extinguished by him. It is the very tool she uses to secure her future.
But she's securing a future with the man she has to constantly maneuver around.
Exactly. And the text tells us that the stupidity with which he was favored by nature would actually guard their courtship from requiring any genuine charm. She isn't blinded by him, nor does she try to convince herself that he is something he is not. She successfully manipulates his predictability. Because he is so transparent in his vanity and his groveling respect for rank, he is incredibly easy for a woman of Charlotte's intellect to manage. She doesn't have to perform a complex romantic attachment, she merely has to orchestrate his environment. This requires a formidable presence of mind.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame it quite differently. Navigating a fool's vanity might be a display of tactical intelligence, but it requires a fundamental intellectual dishonesty that the text actively critiques. We really have to weigh the efficacy of Charlotte's pragmatic philosophy against the romantic idealism represented by Elizabeth, which the novel ultimately champions.
But does it champion it for everyone or just for those who can afford it?
It champions it as a moral baseline. Listen to Charlotte's explicit philosophy in the text. She tells Elizabeth that happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance, and that it is better to know as little as possible of the defects of the person with whom you are to pass your life. She is advocating for willful blindness. Elizabeth immediately and correctly diagnoses the flaw in this transactional approach. She replies, "You make me laugh, Charlotte, but it is not sound. You know it is not sound, and that you would never act in this way yourself."
And yet she does act in exactly that way.
She does, and in doing so, she betrays her own good sense. Charlotte is practicing pure transactional pragmatism. She's essentially treating marriage like a corporate merger, completely divorcing it from human connection. If we contrast Charlotte's approach with the genuine affection and mutual respect seen in the early interactions between Jean and Bingley, or the intellectually rigorous sparring between Elizabeth and Darcy, we see what the text puts forward as the ideal. A marriage must be founded on respect and genuine understanding. Charlotte dismisses this entirely. She trades the pursuit of true respect for the guarantee of a house. Elizabeth rightly identifies this as an unsound and ultimately corrosive philosophy.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. If we're going to evaluate the effectiveness of romantic idealism versus pragmatism, we have to look at where that idealism actually leaves the characters who practice it. You bring up Jane and Bingley as the counterexample to Charlotte's transactional pragmatism. We all know Jane gets completely outmaneuvered by Bingley's sisters in London. Her reliance on passive affection and romantic idealism leaves her profoundly vulnerable. Yes, eventually, through immense luck in Darcy's intervention. But by chapter 24, Jane is completely separated from Bingley. She is left heartbroken in London, relying on the hope that Bingley will somehow return to her, completely stripped of her own agency. And the brilliant and, frankly, chilling part is that Charlotte saw it coming miles away. Back in chapter 6, Charlotte explicitly warns Elizabeth about Jane's behavior.
The secure him first, fall in love later speech.
Exactly. She warns that if a woman conceals her affection too well, she may lose the opportunity of fixing him. Elizabeth dismisses this as mercenary, trusting in the natural course of true love. But Charlotte was undeniably right. Jane's idealistic passivity nearly costs her her future. While Jane is languishing in London waiting for a romantic rescue, Charlotte has used her unsentimental pragmatism to yield immediate, concrete results. She has secured a husband, a parsonage, and a guaranteed place in society. Idealism is a luxury that requires other people to act honorably. Pragmatism, as Charlotte wields it, relies only on one's own agency.
I am not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it defines success purely by the fact that she got a roof over her head, but you're completely ignoring the psychological nightmare that comes with it. When we consider the threat of destitution against the reality of a bad marriage, the text offers us a very dark, very explicit warning of what Charlotte's future will actually look like. And that warning is Mr. Bennet.
Ah, the patriarchal foil.
He is the ultimate example of a brilliant mind trapped in a lifelong union with a fool. And how does he react to the news of Charlotte's engagement? He is delighted. He says it gratifies him to discover that Charlotte Lucas, whom he used to think tolerably sensible, is as foolish as his wife. He recognizes exactly what Charlotte has done. And look at how Mr. Bennet survives his own marriage.
He retreats.
He retreats completely. He goes to his library. He uses bitter sarcasm as a shield against his own family. He has alienated himself entirely from the emotional life of his household because he cannot bear the mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper of his wife. A bad marriage is a fate far worse than remaining single because it creates an inescapable, daily isolation. Charlotte is condemning herself to a similarly alienated existence.
That is a fascinating parallel, but we have to look at the glaring difference in their respective privileges. Mr. Bennet has a library to retreat to. Charlotte does not. And more importantly, Mr. Bennet's situation and Charlotte's situation are fundamentally different due to the gender dynamics of the era. Mr. Bennet had the luxury of making a foolish choice based on youthful attraction. Charlotte does not have that luxury, and she is making a highly calculated choice based on pure survival.
But is survival worth isolating yourself from any genuine intellectual companionship?
When the alternative is starvation or absolute dependence, yes. You speak of the threat of poverty as if it were a minor inconvenience compared to a bad marriage. We have to look at the brutal math of Regency survival. Let us look at the Longbourn estate. It is entailed away from the Bennet women.
Right, the infamous entail.
Just to remind our listeners of the brutal math here, the entail meant that because the Bennets only had daughters, their entire estate legally bypasses them and goes to the nearest male heir, which, ironically, is destined to go directly to Mr. Collins himself. If Mr. Bennet dies, his wife and 5 daughters could be thrown out of their home and left utterly destitute. Charlotte's own family is in a similar, if less dramatically entailed position.
Sir William Lucas is comfortable, but certainly not infinitely wealthy.
Exactly. He made a tolerable fortune in trade, was knighted, and quit his business to live at Lucas Lodge, but he does not have vast wealth to pass on to a multitude of children. The text explicitly notes that upon hearing of the engagement, the Lucas boys were relieved from the apprehension of Charlotte's dying an old maid. That phrase alone tells you everything. A single woman without fortune was a burden. She was destined for a life of marginalization, dependence on reluctant relatives, and societal irrelevance. We even see this reflected in Austen's own real-life choice to remain unmarried, understanding the exact financial precarity and reliance on her brothers that it entailed.
Austen understood the stakes, certainly, but Austen herself rejected a highly advantageous marriage to Harris Bigwither because she couldn't stomach the lack of affection. Austen chose the precarity over the compromise.
And Austen was a generational genius who could write her way to some semblance of independence. Charlotte Lucas is not a novelist. To Charlotte, a comfortable home, even with a foolish husband, is not a tragedy. It is a measurable, definitive improvement over the bleak alternative. She gains a household to run, status in her community, and permanent financial security. To dismiss that as a tragedy is to fail to understand the absolute terror of female poverty in the late 18th century.
I see why you emphasize that, but let me give you a different perspective on the internal cost of that transaction. It is true that the economic pressures of the era are undeniably severe, and I do not dispute that the fear of destitution was a terrifying motivator. However, when we look at the totality of Charlotte Lucas's decision, we cannot just look at the ledger book. We must acknowledge what it does to the soul.
You think she breaks her own spirit?
I think she fundamentally breaks her internal compass. Willingly entering a lifelong union with a man entirely devoid of sense, a man whose formal pettiness and groveling respect for rank make him a figure of universal ridicule, requires a crushing of one's own sensibilities. Charlotte possesses a keen mind, yet she deliberately chooses a path that requires her to suppress her intellect and respectability every single day for the sake of an establishment. She has to send him out to work in the garden just to get a moment's peace in her own sitting room.
She orchestrates her peace very effectively, though.
But it's a peace built on avoidance. Elizabeth's idealism, her refusal to settle for a man she cannot respect, even when thwarted or threatened by economic realities, is what preserves the self. Charlotte's capitulation, while securing her physical comfort, sacrifices the very integrity of her mind. She survives, yes, but at the cost of her own moral and intellectual life. She becomes a manager of a fool rather than a partner to an equal.
And yet, judging Charlotte Lucas by the luxury of Elizabeth Bennet's idealism ignores those uncompromising material realities Austen went to great lengths to establish. Elizabeth can hold out for a Darcy. She has the charm, the youth, and frankly, the protagonist's plot armor. Charlotte, plain, 27, and without fortune, cannot.
So she just settles for the absolute bottom of the barrel?
We certainly remain in thoughtful disagreement about whether the absolute necessity of mere physical survival justifies the profound compromise of the mind and spirit. It is a very heavy price to pay for a parsonage, indeed. And perhaps that tension between Elizabeth's fierce, uncompromising idealism and Charlotte's brilliant, unsentimental pragmatism is a testament to the enduring complexity of the source material itself. It forces us to ask what we would actually do when the brutal math of reality sets in.
Indeed. Austen provides no easy answers, leaving the listener to weigh the ultimate cost of Charlotte's choice for themselves. There is certainly much more to explore within the text regarding these contrasting philosophies of survival and self-respect. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.